When one thinks of high-speed rail, we often turn to the archetypical bullet trains of Asia. Whether the high-speed rail projects of the Republic and People's Republic of China, the KTX Express of South Korea, and the most familiar and exemplary of them all, the Shinkansen of Japan. And as both immensely impressive feats of engineering and practical infrastructure, one would ought to thank the Shinkansen, itself the absolute pride of Japanese rail engineering since its opening in 1964. However, what if I were to tell you that the Shinkansen, not even the original Type 0 series, was the first high-speed train in Asia? To find that, we would have to go before the post-war, and even before the war itself, to a train which, while still the relative magnum opus of Japanese rail engineering for the time, was not even in Japan itself, but instead operated along the vast sweeping plains in what is now northeastern China. This is the story of the Asia Express. What would later become the Asia Express stemmed from a unique infrastructural context. Back in Korea during the 1890s, in the region that would soon become the first continental subject of the Japanese Empire, the peninsula's first ever railways were being developed. While both Japanese and American private interests would begin their respective railroad projects in the 1890s around the same time. Unfortunately for Japan, however, it would be the American railway, the line between Incheon and Seoul, that would be the first to begin construction in 1896. Thus, as the American rail line was completed in 1899 and the Japanese rail line finally completed in 1905, this meant that the entirety of the Japanese rail line had to be constructed in standard gauge. Even after Japan's direct annexation of Korea in 1910, it meant that Japan had to build all subsequent rail lines in standard gauge. This is why, at least for much of modern history, the Japanese referred to standard gauge as Chosun gauge. Chosun being the name the Japanese referred to Korea as. Anyways, this new use of Chosun gauge came with its own respective advantages and disadvantages. The main disadvantage being that the Japanese couldn't just simply transfer the engines and rolling stock they were using in their home islands, as the Japanese built the railways in both their home islands and in their model colony of Taiwan in the narrower Cape gauge. Thus, all Japanese government railroad engines and rolling stock were built for Cape gauge. Consequently, the main rail operator in Japanese Korea, the Chosun Government Railway, along with the main private railway operator, the Chosun Railway Company, had to have entirely new classes of engine and rolling stock purpose-built for its standard gauge rail lines. However, the main advantage of these larger standard gauge lines was in their raw engineering potential, as unlike the smaller, narrower Cape gauge lines, the standard lines could handle much larger engines. This meant that heavier and, most importantly, faster engines could operate much better on standard gauge. Also enabled by the greater width of standard gauge, enabling slightly larger, hence potentially more powerful engines. Though it wouldn't be in Korea that the Japanese would later unleash this absolute engineering potential. With Japan's victory over the Russo-Japanese War in 1907, Japan inherited the single Russian broad gauge line spanning from Vladivostok to Harbin down to Port Arthur. This low-quality Russian broad gauge line, which comprised the bulk of the Chinese Eastern Railway, would be converted and largely upgraded to the standards of the nearest Japanese rail lines, those in Korea. This new standard gauge railway network would be privatized by the Japanese under the new South Manchuria Railway Company. The South Manchuria Railway Company, or shortened Manchutetsudo or Mantetsu, wouldn't just operate the rail lines, but would also own the land around the rail lines, including but not limited to the farmland, real estate, and most notably the mines that she would develop in the iron and coal-rich valleys of Manchuria. The company was effectively the modern industrial 20th century Japanese equivalent to the old British East India Company. Fast forwarding to the mid-1930s, the South Manchuria Railway needed a new, modern, passenger steam locomotive to haul a new express service passing through the under-construction city of Shinkansen, capital of the then recently founded Manchukuo. The man the South Manchuria Railway Company would hire to design the new engine, a man by the name of Nobutaro Yoshino, had been studying under none other than one of America's major locomotive manufacturers, Alco, for quite some time. It was there where he bore witness to the age of the streamliner, a design movement that resulted in locomotives being adorned in modernist shrouding. which not only transformed steam locomotives into the aesthetic pinnacle of the streamlined modern movement, but also significantly minimized their profile as to render them more aerodynamic and thus reach greater top speeds. And so when he was designing a new modern passenger steam locomotive for the South Manchuria Railway, a railway operating on a large modern standard gauge railway network that could handle much more powerful and faster locomotives, Nobutaro seemingly couldn't resist to pour all his technical know-how, experience, and inspiration into what would be the absolute pinnacle and magnum opus of Japanese railway engineering. Both Kawasaki Heavy Industries and Shahiko Works would work tirelessly around the clock, day and night, to produce the future of passenger travel in Asia. Then, after months upon months of intense work, in 1934, it was completed. Delivered to the South Manchuria Railway in Dalian, was the future of passenger transportation in Asia. This new class of modern 462 passenger steam locomotive, coined the Pashina class, would be the engine to haul the South Manchuria Railroad's new express service between Dalian and Hesinking, the Asia Express. The Pashinas, adorned in their Prussian blue liveries, were the pinnacle of Japanese rail engineering. The engine held many upon many engineering accomplishments, from being one of the world's first fully streamlined steam locomotives and the first fully streamlined locomotive in Asia, and being fitted with many relatively modern features such as a fully automated stoker. The most noteworthy accomplishment of the Pashina class, however, was its exceptional top speed, achieving a recorded top speed of over 85 miles per hour. While slower than the top speeds of many passenger engines throughout Europe and America, was still far ahead of that of what had been built in Asia, and even far ahead of what the Japanese had built for their own railways before. The Pashinas were so far ahead of any other locomotive built in Asia that American reporters initially inquired what American manufacturer built the engine, struggling to believe that the Japanese had built such an advanced piece of rail machinery. The coaches hauled by the Pashina class for the Asia Express, generally mirroring the rolling stock assortment of passenger express trains in America, were the first in the world to be consistently streamlined, air-conditioned, and lightweight. The Asia Express would consist of multiple baggage cars, followed by dining cars, third-class cars, second-class cars, first-class cars, and concluding with a first-class observation car, with the observation car finishing off with a modern streamlined rounded end, like those on the most modern streamliners at the time. Dining car would provide all sorts of luxurious amenities, such as a special Asia Express cocktail served by Russian Manchurian waitresses. The Asia Express would enter service in November of 1934, with the new Asian capital city of Hesinking finally having a new Asia Express to service it. Disembarking from Dalian in the Japanese Kwantung-Lis, the Asia Express would travel through the main urban industrial corridor of Manchukuo, passing through Mukden, stopping at the new capital city of Hesinking, before passengers would then be transferred to a new train, concluding at Harbin. Combined with a frequent passenger shipping service between the Japanese home islands and Dalian, the Asia Express was more than suitable for providing the main express passenger service for the South Manchuria Railroad, mostly servicing Japanese immigrants, tourists, and foreigners throughout the major modern urban centers of Manchukuo. With its impressive modernist aesthetics, engineering triumphs, and other good feats, exploded into the figurehead and icon of Japanese modernity, frequently featuring as a popular motif in Japanese art, literature, propaganda, and all forms of Japanese media at the time. To say that the Pashina class engine and an extension the Asia Express was a huge source of pride for the Japanese nation would be a severe understatement. The Asia Express was the figurehead of Japanese modernity in the 1930s. Even from many of the skeptic foreign, particularly American rail critics, the Asia Express would receive overwhelmingly positive reception. The Asia Express marked the beginning of the then future of modern passenger travel in Asia. Unfortunately, just a few years after the Asia Express first entered service, in July 1937, war would break out in Asia. While the service of the Asia Express would be relatively uninterrupted by the breaking out of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Asia Express actually serving the transportation of Imperial Japanese Army officers and the odd visiting Wehrmacht officer, the outbreak of the Pacific Theater in 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would bear immense material strain on Imperial Japan and in extension its pet project of Manchuria. Thus, in 1943, for the time being, the Asia Express would be halted. With this seemingly being a temporary measure, Following When Japan surrendered to the Allies in August of 1945, both the South Manchuria Railroad and even Manchukuo itself were dissolved. And with that, the Asia Express ceased to exist. This would not be the end for the Pashinas, though. Reclassified by the communist-operated China State Railway as the SL7, machinists would be frequently employed to haul local Chinese passenger trains, rumored to have even been employed once to haul the personal train of Chairman Mao Zedong. While most of the Pashinas would retain their original form, albeit with new either baby blue or black, white, and red China State Railway livery, many would have their streamlining reduced to expose the driving wheels, with some even having their entire streamlining removed. Successfully serving under the China State Railway from the late 1940s well into the 1980s, the Pashinas would finally be fully decommissioned from service, fortunately with 2 Pashina-class engines actually making it to preservation, remaining to this day on static display in the Shenyang Railway Museum. Other than the cultural market left on Showa-era Japan, some modern Japanese media have also paid tribute to the Pashina class. However, the greatest legacy of the Pashina class and the Asia Express would be the very project that it gave massive inspiration and practical experience to. Seeing the immense success of a modern standard gauge high-speed passenger train in Manchuria, proposals were made for implementing a modern standard gauge high-speed rail line in Japan itself. This new trunk line, or in Japanese, Shinkansen, was proposed to operate along the eastern seaboard of Japan. And in 1940, the first design of a Shinkansen locomotive, a design which very heavily drew from the Pashinas, would be drafted in 1940, being coined by those familiar with it as Danganresha, translated, the bullet train. While this original 1930s iteration of the plan would fail due to the outbreak of the war, the Shinkansen project, a project spawned by the very success of the Asia Express, would, in its post-war 1950s revival, finally triumph in 1964, with the first successful operation of the first Type 0 series of Shinkansen. It was thanks to the successes of the Asia Express that the Shinkansen, the future of modern passenger travel in Asia, would ultimately succeed. Thank you all so much for watching, though the next video will take a while due to my schedule.